Welcome to Homiletics. We're going to continue looking at the 8 steps to preparing and preaching a sermon. We talked about choose the passage in a series, out of a series, and step 2 is study the passage, and we basically covered that when we looked at the factual data sheet from Mark. So we're going to go to step 3. Step 3 is discover the main point of the sermon. So under step 2, I am asking you to read just the introduction part to that, because it talks about G. Campbell Morgan, who was a very famous preacher. He was followed by Martin Lloyd-Jones at Westminster Chapel. But G. Campbell Morgan wrote a lot of commentaries, and he was a very famous preacher, teacher. And his philosophy was for sermon preparation or preaching through a book, he would read it 40 to 50 times before he would preach through that book. And then also in step 2 in that introduction, I give an example that Mark Dever gives. Mark Dever studies 35 hours a week for sermon preparation, and a big part of that initial part of that 35 hours is just reading and rereading the passage. So that's a big part of step 2, study the passage. But now we're at step 3, discover the main point of the sermon. And I like that designation because there's a lot of different ways to describe this one sentence, the sermon reduced to one sentence. But I like Tony Merita's main point of the sermon, or MPS. So what it is the sermon reduced to one sentence. It is the one truth about your sermon that you want your people to remember when they walk out of the service. Just imagine your people, some of your people go to work on Monday morning. They start talking to some friends, and one of them asks, "What did your pastor preach on yesterday?" Well, your church member, my church member, should be able to give them, without much hesitation, a sentence like this: "Our pastor preached on you must be born again." That's the main point of the sermon. That's the sermon reduced to one sentence. Different homileticians call it different, give it different titles. The big idea, that's Haddon Robinson. The theme, the thesis, the proposition. Haddon Robinson talks about also the exegetical idea, or the MPT. The exegetical, the main point of the text. That's the way Tony Merita would do that. But Haddon Robinson calls it the exegetical idea. And then the proposition, or the main point of the sermon, he calls it the homiletical idea, or the big idea. So we're going to discuss the difference between the MPT, main point of the text, MPS, main point of the sermon. Main point of the text is that when you're doing your original study, what was the one idea of this passage for the original audience? What is the summary statement of the author's intent for the original audience? And then you convert that into a timeless principle for your audience, or the MPS, main point of the sermon. Here's some different homiletic teachers' designation: the main idea of the text, or the essence of the text in the sentence. Stephen Alford, the dominating theme. But Tony Merita, main point of the sermon, I really like. Because you can use that in your preaching. It just fits better in a sermon rather than what was used to be the proposition. That was a very common designation for this sermon reduced to one sentence, the proposition. But it's a little awkward to use that in a sermon. But when you come to the main point of your sermon and you're preaching, you can say to your audience, here's the main point of my sermon this morning. It just fits. It helps with the flow. One of the preachers of yesteryear, J.H. Jowett, just made an incredible statement here that every sermon needs to have this sentence around which the whole sermon is built. And so different preachers and teachers of homiletics see the value of this unifying sentence. James Braga, right here, used to use James Braga's book, How to Prepare Sermons, until I started using Tony Merita's, because they both have the same philosophy of a sermon, the same nuts and bolts of a sermon. I like Tony Merita because he's just more current. But James Braga talked about 4 different kinds of main points of the sermon: the declarative, the interrogative, and then he talks about the hortatory and the exclamatory. The declarative is just simply it's a declaration. It's not a demand. It's a declaration, such as Jesus demands the new birth for all people. And so here's just a variety of ways to state that one sentence. Just to give you some variety, to break out of the monotony, you can convert the main point of the sermon to an interrogative. You could say, how can a person be born again, or why must all people be born again? Just to give variety. And we're going to talk about the structure here a little more later. But in the introduction, this is basically your template. You have attention step, interest step, lead into the subject step with the theme of the book, and then the development of the theme. So you can do next the main point of the sermon, or just for variety's sake, you can convert that main point of the sermon into the interrogative. And then you would have your transition to the main point. There's a hortatory that James Braga talks about, or what we call the demand. So you take that declaration, all people, the declaration, let me back up here. The declaration, Jesus demands the new birth for all people. That's a declaration. If I want to convert that to a demand, then how would I change that declarative MPS into a demand? You must be born again, just like Jesus said it to Nicodemus. And I give us another example there. And then Braga talks about the exclamatory. This is basically, there's just not much difference between this and and the demand. It's basically, according to Braga, using it in the Psalms, like in Psalm 103. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name, Psalm 103:1. And your exclamatory would be, bless the Lord, praise the Lord for what he has done and who he is. But let's talk about some general principles concerning the MPS, main point of the sermon. First of all, the main point of the sermon should include one demand, not two. F.B. Meyer was another preacher of yesteryear, wrote about preaching. He said, in a sermon, we don't talk about 7 different things. We talk about one thing 7 different ways. So we're probably not going to have 7 main divisions. We'll have 3, 4, maybe 5 at the most. But you see the point? Let's say we have a sermon with 5 main divisions. We're not preaching 5 different points. We have one main point of the sermon that we say 5 different things about. That's a great point. And so we want to just keep that main point of the sermon simple. And then the rest of the sermon is going to elaborate upon it. Keeping it simple, I think, is very important. And then, secondly, the main point of the sermon needs to be a complete sentence with a subject, ought word, and an action verb. So we would not say to our congregation, today I'm preaching on prayer. That's sort of bland, sort of general. What could we say? Well, let's break it down. What needs to be in the main point of the sermon? The main point of the sermon should have an action verb rather than a state of being. The main point of the sermon should be in the active voice, not passive, because we are asking them to do something. And the main point of the sermon should be affirmative rather than the negative, for the most part. Because we just don't want to tell them not what to do. We want to tell them what to do. So considering these 3 points, the above main point of the sermon would be better stated rather than, today I'm going to preach on prayer. Using these 3 points right here, you must pray effectively for powerful results. So let's just, when you read through this, convert this statement into an MPS that has these 3 characteristics. And I'm just going to leave that to you for when you read through this to do that. Number 3, the main point of the sermon addresses your current audience, not the original audience. That's why we want to make it a timeless principle, not just a summary statement for the original audience, but a timeless principle for our audience. And that's converting the exegetical idea, according to Haddon Robinson, into the homiletical idea. And with Tony Merida, converting the MPT, the main point of the text, what's a summary statement of the text that the author had for the original audience, into the main point of the sermon for my people. Jerry Vines and Jim Shattuck was Tony Merida's homiletic teacher. They converted the central idea of the text into the main point of the sermon. So we want to address our current audience, and that's going to make that important sentence relevant. The main point of our sermon would not be Jesus commanded Nicodemus to be born again. No, that's the main point of the text. That's the original idea or intent of the author to the original audience. We would say, you must be born again. That converts the summary statement into a timeless principle. The MPS must be concise, not including all the divisions, all the main divisions, or what you would say about the MPS. The main divisions is what you are saying about the MPS. And so, Donald Sanukian, in his book, Biblical Invitation to Preaching, that's like a next stage up. That's a great book to get. And so he likes just giving all of that up front, which is good. It's good. There's a teaching adage that says, tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them what you just told them. In other words, you're telling them up front the main point of the sermon. And then you're giving them the main point of the sermon. And then you're repeating the main point of the sermon and the main divisions. So that's good on occasion to do that. But for the most part, you give the main point of the sermon and then you develop it later. That sort of holds them in suspense a little bit. John R.W. Stout was a very well-known preacher. And he talked about isolate the dominant thought of the text. Again, just emphasizing the importance of that single sentence. So how do you do it? Number 1, exegete the passage using the grammatical, historical, hermeneutic. state the exegetical idea or Marita's main point of the text. I just gave you an example of the main point of the text. Jesus commanded Nicodemus to be born again. So we want to find the exegetical, and then we want to convert it into a timeless principle or the main point of the sermon. So let's walk through those. The exegete the passage using the grammatical historical hermeneutic. So what you do, I'm going to give you an example from Ephesians and an example from Mark. Excuse me. You find the theme of the book, theme of Ephesians, the unity that love can bring. This is according to Howard Honer's commentary. Then the development of the theme, which in Ephesians is twofold. You have a doctrinal unity, chapters 1 to 3, practical unity, 4 to 6. And then in the next step, you find your passage where it is, and we're looking at Ephesians 1, which is in the doctrinal section. And the primary doctrine that he uses to illustrate unity is the doctrine of the Trinity. All three persons of the Trinity are perfectly united. And so that's the first example. So you find the theme of the book and then the theme of your passage, which in chapter 1 is praising God for each person's involvement in my salvation, each person of the Trinity's involvement in my salvation. In verses 3 to 6, God the Father chooses believers in eternity past and is praised. At the end of each one of these divisions, you have this repeated statement to the praise of the glory of his grace. So you got that repetition. That helps us find the main divisions. Then you have the content, which is each section is about one person of the Trinity. That's using the historical grammatical method of interpretation to find not only the theme of the book, but the theme of your passage. Let's go to Mark. The theme of Mark is Jesus Christ is the Son of God who makes disciples. And here's how the theme of Mark is developed. We looked at this in the factual data sheet. It's around 3 geographical locations. In Galilee, Jesus, the Son of God, makes disciples with the multitudes. Chapter 1, 14 to 8, 21. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus, the Son of God, makes disciples with his disciples. Mark 8, 22 to 10, 52. Then the third location is actually in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, Jesus, the Son of God, makes disciples in the world. Chapters 11 to 16. So there's the theme of the book. There's the development of the theme. In my passage is in Mark 1, 21 to 35. MPT, main point of the text, Jesus had right priorities for ministry. So this is the main point for the original audience. I want to convert that to a timeless principle for my audience. Main point of the sermon, disciples must establish right priorities. See, that's relevant. It's a timeless principle. Interrogative how? Transition statement, by following the example of Christ. So this is sort of a template again. The transition statement transitions to the first main division. And here it is, by going to the place of worship. And we're going to talk about this next time, developing the sermon outline. You're going to have these, what are called rhetorical processes: explanation, argumentation, illustration, application. And each of these answers a question. So, here's the main point of the sermon. Disciples must. This is a demand proposition because we want our hearers to be doers of the word. What is the main demand of this passage? And we're using how instead of why. But you walk through these rhetorical processes, explaining what it means, proving that is the meaning, showing what it looks like, and then applying it to your audience. And here's the other main divisions and your conclusion. So exegete the passage, convert or state the main point of the the main point of the text of the passage, and then convert that into the main point of the sermon. And so I elaborate a little bit right there on doing that. And I've given you some examples already with that you must be born again. So now, how to move from the main point of the sermon to the first main division. You move from the main point of the sermon to the interrogative. And you're using one of the 5 interrogative adverbs: why, how, what, when, or where. And I think why and how are the most common, and those are the 2 that I recommend. And I gave you an example right up here. So after the main point of the sermon is stated, disciples must establish the right priorities. I'm using the interrogative how. That's followed by a transitional sentence: by following the example of Christ. Okay? So you have the interrogative, you have the transitional sentence. When I was taking homiletics, Mr. LeGrand was my homiletics teacher. So we had to build our first sermon. My first sermon was from Ephesians 2:8 and 9. This is back in the dark ages. And I was actually pastoring a little church my last 2 years of undergrad. And I'll never forget the relief that I had when I found out the basic ingredients here to building a sermon. So I went into the pulpit and I preached Ephesians 2:8 and 9. Here was the main point of my sermon: you must be saved by grace through faith. That was good. What do I say next? Well, interrogative sentence. This is my very next sentence. How can you be saved by grace? What do I say next? Well, here's the very next sentence to say. By taking these steps in Ephesians 2:8 and 9, by faith in Jesus Christ, by grace, not works. I could have used why. You must be saved by grace through faith. Why? Transition, because. So if you use how, your transition is going to be by, and then your main divisions are going to start with by. If you use why in your transition, you're going to have the word because. Reasons will be your key word up here with how. Steps. Steps is the key word. So all this just sort of fits together. And I can remember the great relief that I had when I was able to just walk through that sermon and follow this template and just be comfortable in knowing what to say at each stage of the sermon. So I hope that you'll find that relief as well.